Eliza Lawson pressed her forehead against the small attic window, watching the distant plains shimmer in the summer heat of 1875. The sprawling Wyoming territory stretched before her like a golden ocean, beautiful and unreachable. 3 days had passed since her father had locked her in this dusty prison, all because she'd refused to marry Harold Whitaker, the wealthiest rancher in Sweetwater County, and a man 30 years her senior. "I'd rather wither away up here than be that man's bride," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. At 20 years old, Eliza had inherited her mother's stubborn spirit and fiery independence. With her mother 5 years in the grave, her father seemed determined to rid himself of his only remaining responsibility. Eliza sighed and turned away from the window. The attic was stifling, the summer heat trapped under the sloping roof making it nearly unbearable during the day. Her father had provided a small bed, a chamber pot, and enough food and water to keep her alive but uncomfortable. His last words still rang in her ears. "You'll stay up here until you come to your senses, girl." She sat on the edge of the bed, her simple cotton dress damp with perspiration. Her dark blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders. Through the thin walls, she could hear the familiar sounds of the ranch workers shouting to one another, horses whinnying, the distant lowing of cattle. Life continuing without her. Just as she was considering another attempt to pry open the locked trapdoor, she heard an unusual sound, a scraping against the roof tiles. Eliza froze, listening intently. It couldn't be her father, he never came up during the day. The scraping continued, moving closer to her window. Cautiously, she approached the small window again and peered out. Her heart nearly stopped when a face suddenly appeared upside down, looking in at her. She stumbled backward with a startled cry. "Miss Lawson," a male voice called softly. "Miss Eliza Lawson." Eliza approached the window again, warily this time. The face belonged to a young man, perhaps a few years older than herself. She recognized him, Matthew Sutton, one of the cowboys who'd started working on the neighboring ranch earlier that spring. "Mr. Sutton," she whispered, shocked. "What on earth are you doing on our roof?" His face broke into a relieved smile. "I've come to help you, Miss Lawson. The whole town's talking about how your father locked you up for refusing old Whitaker." Eliza's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "My father has no right." "No, he doesn't," Matthew agreed, his blue eyes serious now. "Which is why I'm here. Can you open this window any wider?" Eliza tried the rusty latch, putting her weight behind it until it finally gave. The window creaked open, letting in a blessed rush of fresh air. Matthew was hanging from the edge of the roof by his fingertips, his legs dangling. "Stand back," he instructed. With surprising agility, he swung himself through the window, landing lightly on the attic floor. Now that he was standing before her, Eliza could see him properly. Matthew Sutton was tall and lean, his skin bronzed from working outdoors. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes were the color of the Wyoming sky. He was dressed in simple working clothes, denims, boots, and a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. "This is madness," Eliza said, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "If my father catches you, he won't catch me," Matthew said confidently. "He rode into town about an hour ago with 2 of the ranch hands. I watched them go. But why would you risk this for me?" "We've barely spoken 2 words to each other." Matthew's expression softened. "I've spoken more than 2 words to you, Miss Lawson. We danced at the spring social, remember? And you helped tend my arm when that new stallion threw me against the fence." Eliza did remember. She'd been struck by his kind eyes and gentle manner, so different from the rough cowboys who usually worked the Wyoming ranches. But she'd never imagined he'd paid her any particular mind. "Besides," Matthew continued, "what your father's doing isn't right. No one should be forced to marry against their will, especially not to a man like Whitaker." Eliza felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to do. Father says if I don't agree by the end of the week, the wedding will happen anyway. He's already arranged everything with the minister." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Then we need to get you out of here." He glanced around the attic. "Do you have anything you want to take with you? We don't have much time." "Take with me. Where would I go? My sister owns a small boarding house in Laramie." "You'd be safe there until we figure something out." Eliza's mind raced. Leave? She'd never been farther than the nearest town, but the alternative was marrying Harold Whittaker, becoming the property of a man who looked at her like she was a prized heifer. "I have an aunt in Denver," she said slowly. "She wrote after Mother died, offering me a home if I ever needed one." Matthew nodded. "Denver's good, we can get you there." His confidence gave her courage. Quickly, Eliza gathered her few treasured possessions, her mother's cameo brooch, a small book of poetry, a change of clothes, and wrapped them in a shawl. "The trapdoor's locked from the outside," she explained, pointing to the floor. Matthew examined the window. "Same way I came in then." "Can you climb down? I brought a rope." Eliza hesitated, looking at the steep drop to the ground below. I think so." Matthew smiled encouragingly. "I'll go first and help you down." He secured the rope to a sturdy beam and tossed the end out the window. With practiced ease, he slipped out the opening and began his descent. Eliza took a deep breath and followed, her heart pounding as she swung her legs over the sill. The ground seemed impossibly far below, but Matthew's strong hands guided her feet to find purchase on the rough shingles. She clung to the rope, moving slowly, panic threatening to overwhelm her when a shingle came loose beneath her foot. "I've got you," Matthew called from below. "You're doing fine." When she reached the edge of the roof, Matthew reached up and gripped her waist, lifting her down the last few feet as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, they stood close together, his hands still at her waist, her palms against his chest. Eliza could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. "Thank you," she whispered. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should hurry. My horse is tied in the cottonwood grove." Together they crossed the yard, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings. Eliza's legs trembled with each step, expecting at any moment to hear her father's angry shouts. But they reached the grove without incident, where a handsome chestnut gelding waited patiently. "This is Rusty," Matthew said, patting the horse's neck. "He's strong enough to carry us both to town." "Town?" Eliza asked, confused. "I thought we were heading to Laramie. We'll need supplies first and to catch the eastbound train." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. "Are you certain about this, Miss Lawson? Once we leave, there's no turning back." Eliza thought of the attic, of Harold Whittaker's weathered hands and cold eyes, of her father's unyielding face as he'd locked her away. Then she thought of freedom, of Denver, of a life she might choose for herself. "I'm certain," she said firmly. Matthew nodded and urged Rusty forward. As they rode away from the only home she'd ever known, Eliza felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. The man behind her was practically a stranger, yet she was entrusting him with her future. It was madness, surely, but it felt more right than anything had in a long, long time. The journey to town was tense, both of them constantly looking over their shoulders for pursuit. Matthew kept Rusty at a steady pace, not so fast as to attract attention but quick enough to put distance between them and the ranch. They stayed off the main road, following game trails through the rolling hills. "How did you know I was locked in the attic?" Eliza asked, breaking the silence. Matthew's voice came from just behind her ear. "Martha Jenkins, your father's cook, told her cousin, who works at the general store. Word travels fast in small towns. And you just decided to rescue me, just like that." There was a pause before he answered. "I've been watching you for a while, Miss Lawson, not in an improper way," he added hastily. "I just noticed you, the way you are with the horses. How you always have a kind word for everyone, even old Sam who doesn't speak to anybody." Another pause. "The way you stand up to your father when he's being unreasonable." Eliza felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I notice," he said simply. They reached the outskirts of Sweetwater by mid-afternoon. The small town consisted of little more than a main street with essential businesses: general store, saloon, blacksmith, hotel, and the train station at the far end. Matthew guided Rusty to a small livery stable run by a friend of his, away from curious eyes. "Wait here," he told Eliza, helping her down. "I'll see about train tickets and supplies." "I have some money," she offered, reaching for the small purse she'd brought. Matthew shook his head. "Save it. You might need it later." While he was gone, Eliza sat nervously in the stable's small office, jumping at every sound. What if her father had returned early? What if he'd already raised the alarm? Sweetwater wasn't large enough to hide in for long. When Matthew finally returned, his expression was grim. "Bad news, your father's in town and he's looking for you. Somehow he already knows you're gone." Eliza's heart sank. "How is that possible? One of the ranch hands must have come by the house and found you missing." He ran a hand through his hair. "The train doesn't leave until tomorrow morning. We need somewhere to hide until then." "What about your sister in Laramie? Could we ride there?" Matthew shook his head. "It's too far over 100 miles, and your father would expect that. He's already sent telegrams to all the surrounding towns." He thought for a moment. "I have another idea, but you might not like it. At this point, Mr. Sutton, I'm open to suggestions. There's an abandoned line shack about 5 miles west of here in the foothills. I found it while tracking stray cattle last month. No one would think to look for us there. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being caught. Lead the way, Mr. Sutton." "Matthew," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities now, Miss Lawson." She smiled despite her fear. "Eliza, then." They waited until dusk before leaving the stable, taking back roads out of town. The abandoned line shack was exactly as Matthew had described: small, dusty, and forgotten, but with 4 solid walls and a roof. It had been used by cowboys watching over herds in the winter months, with a small stove, a rough table, and a single cot. Matthew lit a lantern he'd brought and set about making the place habitable, sweeping out the worst of the dust and starting a small fire in the stove to ward off the evening chill. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it should keep us hidden until morning." Eliza looked around the humble shelter with grateful eyes. "It's perfect." She sat on the edge of the cot, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. "I can't believe I actually left. I've thought about it so many times, but I never had the courage." Matthew sat beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear," he smiled. "And for what it's worth, I think you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Something in his voice made her really look at him. In the soft glow of the lantern, his features were both strong and gentle. There was an openness to his face that she found incredibly appealing, a kindness in his eyes that made her feel safe despite the precarious situation. "Why are you helping me, Matthew? The truth this time." He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of hard work. "The first time I saw you was at church last Easter. You were wearing a blue dress and you smiled at a little girl who dropped her doll." He shook his head as if embarrassed by the memory. "It sounds foolish, but something about that smile, I couldn't get it out of my mind." "That doesn't sound foolish at all," Eliza said softly. "When I heard what your father was planning, forcing you to marry Whitaker," his jaw tightened. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Their eyes met, and Eliza felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her hand, but instead he stood abruptly. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." He took his coat off and laid it on the floor. "I'll sleep here. You take the cot." Eliza wanted to protest. The floor looked hard and uncomfortable, but she recognized the propriety he was trying to maintain. Despite their unusual circumstances, he was determined to protect her reputation as well as her freedom. Sleep came fitfully that night. Eliza kept starting awake, certain she'd heard hoofbeats or her father's angry voice. Each time, she'd see Matthew sitting by the window, keeping watch, his profile illuminated by moonlight. His quiet presence was reassuring, and eventually she drifted into a deeper sleep. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the dirty windows. Matthew had already been outside, checking for any sign they'd been followed. He returned with a handful of wild berries, offering them to Eliza with a smile. "Not much of a breakfast, I'm afraid." "It's lovely," she assured him, touched by the thoughtful gesture. "What's our plan for today?" "The train leaves at 10 o'clock. We'll approach the station from the south side where there's less chance of being seen. I purchased the tickets yesterday all the way to Denver." Eliza felt a surge of hope. "You really think we can make it?" "I do." His confidence was unwavering. "By this time tomorrow, you'll be with your aunt, safe and free to make your own choices." They set out as the sun climbed higher, Matthew leading Rusty with Eliza walking beside him. They didn't speak much, both tense and watchful. As the town came into view, Matthew guided them through a stand of trees that would shield their approach to the station. They were nearly there when they heard the sound of horses approaching fast from the direction of town. Matthew pulled Eliza behind a large boulder, holding his finger to his lips. Through a gap, they could see a group of riders passing on the road below her father at the lead, his face set in a dark scowl, followed by Harold Whitaker and several ranch hands. "They're heading toward the line shack," Matthew whispered. "Someone must have seen us or guessed where we went." Eliza's heart pounded painfully in her chest. "The train will be leaving soon. We need to hurry." Abandoning caution, they made their way directly to the station, arriving just as the train was pulling in. Steam billowed across the platform as passengers began to board. Matthew kept Eliza close, his arm protective around her shoulders as they moved through the crowd. They had almost reached the passenger car when a shout rang out behind them. "Eliza, stop right there," her father's voice. Eliza turned to see him pushing through the crowd, his face contorted with rage. Behind him came Harold Whitaker, his cold eyes fixed on her like a predator's. "Go," Matthew urged, pressing the tickets into her hand. "Get on the train, I'll handle this." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Eliza insisted, gripping his arm. Her father reached them, breathing heavily from his run. "You ungrateful girl," he spat, "after everything I've done for you." "And you," he turned to Matthew. "You'll hang for this, Sutton. Kidnapping is a capital offense." "It's not kidnapping when the lady comes willingly," Matthew replied, his voice steady despite the dangerous situation. Harold Whitaker stepped forward, his thin lips curled in a sneer. "The lady is spoken for. She's my fiancée." "I am not," Eliza said, finding her voice at last. "I never agreed to marry you, Mr. Whitaker, and I never will." Her father grabbed her arm roughly. "You'll do as you're told, girl. Now come along before you cause any more embarrassment." Matthew's hand shot out, gripping her father's wrist with enough force to make the older man wince. "Take your hands off her." A crowd was gathering now, passengers and townspeople alike drawn to the confrontation. From the corner of her eye, Eliza saw the conductor checking his pocket watch impatiently. "This is a private family matter," her father announced loudly. "My daughter is unwell. This man has taken advantage of her condition." "That's not true." Eliza cried, looking around desperately at the watching faces. "My father locked me in our attic because I refused to marry Mr. Whitaker. Matthew rescued me." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Public opinion in Sweetwater had always been divided on Jacob Lawson, who was known to be a hard man in business and at home, especially since his wife's death. The sheriff, attracted by the commotion, pushed his way through. "What's going on here, Jacob?" "This cowboy kidnapped my daughter," her father said immediately. "I want him arrested." Sheriff Miller looked from Jacob to Eliza and Matthew, his weathered face unreadable. "Is that true, Miss Lawson? Were you taken against your will?" "No," Eliza said firmly. "I left voluntarily. My father was going to force me to marry Mr. Whitaker against my wishes. He locked me in the attic when I refused." The sheriff raised his eyebrows. "That true, Jacob? You locked your own daughter up." Her father's face flushed dark red. "I was protecting her from making a foolish decision." "Whitaker is a good match, wealthy, established, and 3 times her age," someone in the crowd called out. Harold Whitaker stepped forward, his voice oily. "The girl is confused, Sheriff. We've been planning this wedding for months. Her father and I have an agreement." "An agreement?" Matthew's voice was incredulous. "She's a person, not a piece of property to be traded." The train whistle blew a 5-minute warning. The conductor called for final boarding. Sheriff Miller scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Miss Lawson, you're of legal age, correct?" "Yes, Sheriff." "I turned 20 last winter." "Then as far as I can see, you're free to go where you please and marry who you choose." He turned to Jacob Lawson. "The law doesn't support forcing a grown woman to marry against her will, Jacob, no matter what agreement you might have." Eliza's father spluttered with rage. "She's my daughter, and a citizen of this territory with rights of her own," the sheriff interrupted firmly. "Now, are you and Mr. Whitaker going to step aside peacefully, or do I need to intervene officially?" The threat of official intervention and the public embarrassment it would bring was enough to make both men hesitate. The train whistle blew again. "This isn't over," Jacob Lawson said, his voice low with fury. "You're no daughter of mine, Eliza. Don't ever think to come back." The words cut deep, but Eliza stood tall. "Goodbye, father." She turned to board the train, Matthew close behind her. They found seats quickly, both trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. As the train began to move, Eliza looked out the window to see her father and Harold Whittaker standing on the platform, their faces dark with thwarted anger. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked gently as Sweetwater fell away behind them. Eliza took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her past receding with each turn of the wheels. "I will be." He hesitated, then covered her hand with his own. "I'm sorry about your father. He made his choice," she said, though her voice wavered, "just as I've made mine." As the train gathered speed, carrying them east toward Denver and a new beginning, Eliza found herself studying Matthew's profile. This man who had risked everything for her, a woman he barely knew. A man who looked at her and saw not property or possession, but a person worthy of freedom and choice. "What will you do now?" she asked. "You can't go back to Sweetwater. My father will make good on his threats." Matthew shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I was getting tired of that job anyway. I've heard there's good work to be found in Colorado." "Colorado is a big territory. Denver's supposed to be a fine city," he said casually. "Growing every day, a man with my skills could do well there." Eliza felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "My aunt's house is large. She's mentioned needing someone to help manage her property." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities yet to unfold. "I'd like to court you properly, Eliza Lawson," Matthew said quietly. "If you'd be amenable to that." Eliza smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in her life. "I believe I would be very amenable to that, Matthew Sutton." The train journeyed eastward, carrying them toward Denver and all its promises. They talked for hours, discovering each other's histories, dreams, and hearts. By the time they arrived in Denver the following day, Eliza knew with certainty that her rescue had been just the beginning of their story. Eliza's Aunt Meredith proved to be everything her letters had suggested: warm, independent, and fiercely supportive of her niece's decision to flee an unwanted marriage. Her spacious home in Denver's growing residential district welcomed Eliza with open arms, and true to her word, she offered Matthew work overseeing her various business interests, which included rental properties and a small but thriving millinery shop. Over the following months, Denver became home. Eliza found work assisting in her aunt's shop, discovering a talent for design that surprised and delighted her. Matthew proved himself invaluable to Aunt Meredith's businesses, his practical knowledge and honest nature earning him respect throughout the community. And through it all, their courtship blossomed. Matthew was true to his word. He courted Eliza properly, with chaperoned walks, Sunday drives, and formal calls at her aunt's parlor. Yet there was nothing formal about the connection growing between them. Each day revealed new facets of his character that Eliza admired: his unwavering integrity, his gentle humor, his respect for her independence and opinions. When winter came to Colorado, bringing crisp snow and holiday festivities, Matthew took Eliza on a sleigh ride through the city park. Under a blanket of stars, with the sleigh bells jingling softly and their breath fogging in the cold air, he asked her to be his wife. "Not because anyone says you should be," he clarified, his eyes earnest in the moonlight, "but because I love you, Eliza Lawson. I've loved you since that day in the church, and every day since has only deepened that feeling." Eliza's answer was as clear as the winter sky above them. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They married the following spring in Aunt Meredith's garden as the first roses bloomed. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by new friends they'd made in Denver. Eliza wore a dress of pale blue, the color of the dress she'd worn when Matthew first saw her with her mother's cameo at her throat. No word came from her father, though Eliza had sent him an invitation. His silence was a final confirmation of his choice, but Eliza found she could face it with peace rather than pain. She had found a new family, one built on love and respect rather than obligation and control. As the years passed, Denver grew and changed, and so did the Suttons. Matthew's work ethic and honest dealings helped him establish his own successful business in property development. Eliza's designs became sought after, her small shop attracting customers from across the growing city. They built a comfortable home in a pleasant neighborhood, filling it with books, music, and eventually, the laughter of children, 2 daughters and a son who grew up knowing the value of independence and the power of choosing one's own path. Sometimes on summer evenings, when the western sky blazed with sunset colors, Eliza would think back to that stifling attic in Wyoming, to the young woman who had pressed her forehead against the glass and yearned for freedom. And then she would look at Matthew, at their children playing in the yard, at the life they had built together, and she would marvel at how a moment of courage, her own and that of the cowboy who had climbed a roof to save her, had changed everything. It was not always easy. Life never is. There were struggles and setbacks, arguments and reconciliations. But through it all ran the golden thread of choice, the choice they had made to face life together, to build a partnership based on mutual respect and deepening love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew gave Eliza a locket containing a tiny painting of the Wyoming prairie. Inside was inscribed a simple message: for the courage to choose. Eliza, her once blonde hair now streaked with silver, smiled as she closed the locket over her heart. "We chose well," she told him, standing in the garden of the home they had made together. "We did," Matthew agreed, his blue eyes still as kind and steadfast as they had been that day in the attic so many years ago. He took her hand, his touch as familiar and essential as her own heartbeat. "Every day we choose again." And in that moment, as in all the moments that had led them here, Eliza knew that the greatest freedom was not in escape, but in the journey afterward, the daily choice to love, to grow, to build something lasting from the broken pieces of what came before. They had climbed down from that Wyoming roof into an uncertain future, but together they had found their way home.